Welcome to another exciting episode of Unraveling Intellectual Property with Michael Stein. Today, we're going to be talking about sparking innovation and co-invention, and I am very excited to have Cameron Powell and Gary Shuster of Deep Law Firm. So you guys, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourselves?
Gary?
I am I'm a classmate of Cameron's from law school and have kept up my legal practice and at the same time invented, I think as of next Tuesday, it'll be 257 issued U.S. patents. Most of them I'm the sole inventor on. Some I have co-inventors, but the really cool thing about having both those backgrounds is I feel like I have a better understanding of the whole invention process from, coming up with the concept to, exiting and, moving on to the next one. So it's been fun. The inventing part, if you're considering law school, the inventing part's more fun than the lawyer part.
What technologies are you mostly involved in?
Well, that's sort of the interesting thing is
Okay.
people who over specialize tend to invent in just one area and they tend to not have significant breakthroughs. They tend to be more linear. So I invent in whatever area is bugging me. I mean, I think it's a fantastic question for innovators is what's bothering you? Don't just shrug your shoulders and say, well, I'm stuck with that. No, just tell yourself, I will solve this. Maybe not today, but this is on my list. And so I've ended up, I was a private pilot for a while. And so I have some patents on emergency landing systems for small planes. I have, patents about using ambient sensor data for medical diagnosis. I've got more patents on internet traffic control than I care to admit because I was around when, 100 megabits was, that was instead of paying your mortgage. So it's all the areas really. I don't want to over specialize. There's a saying that no great physics discovery has been made by any physicist over, and then they change the age a lot, but it's usually around 35. And I think that's because they internalize what can't be done. You get too specialized, you know what other people think is impossible, and then you think it's impossible. So, my advice is if you're a fantastic physicist at 35, start doing some electrical engineering at 35. That's where your physics knowledge will give you just enough knowledge to invent, but not so much knowledge that you think you can't invent because it's impossible. So it's never really impossible. There are very few things that are in that category.
All right, let's get some introduction for Cameron here. Cameron?
Cameron Powell. Gary and I graduated the same year. We didn't actually know each other. I tell people it's because Gary was studying. But I did a clerkship with a federal judge. I did 3 years at the Department of Justice and then worked with an IP firm. And then, still quite a long time ago, I got out of the law almost entirely. I was into startups. My tertiary roles was sometimes general counsel, but my main role was I was founding or an executive of or early employee of technology startups. And they were generally all software. A couple of, there's one motor technology. There was one that was blended. We had some patents in software as well as in mail sorting equipment. That was what's now Earth Class Mail, still a viable firm. And so I did nothing but startups, did some coaching and consulting in talent area, executive coaching, business coaching, startup fundraising. And then I just came back into the law about 3.5 years ago.
What prompted that?
Well, I was working at a tech startup as a chief marketing officer this time. And I went to my 2022 law school reunion. Mm-hmm. And one of our classmates, who I knew a little bit better than Gary, but not super well, said, "Hey, you ought to come work with me." And I said, "Well, I haven't done this in 23 years, right? Private practice." And he said, "Yeah, I don't care. I think you'd be great. I see what kinds of questions you ask and how you deal with people." And so I took a week vacation off my job and I went down to Texas and I billed hours for a week. And I thought, this is more fun than when I did it as a 20-something or early 30-something. And so I joined the firm. This was a firm in Texas called Gregor Wynn Arney. Then last year, Gary and I founded Deep Law because we both have a lot of experience in litigation, but we both like to build stuff. I've been more on the building startup side, not necessarily patentable stuff in every case, and going to market with it. And Gary's more the sort of, hard patentable invention type building. But that's kind of how we came together, is that we have just enough overlap that it's helpful, and working styles as well. But he knows entire universes of stuff I know nothing about. And I mean, you really, as Gary alluded to earlier, a lot of creative thinking comes from people in the same room or parts of the same brain being in non-overlapping domains. The example I often give is Steve Jobs. A lot of computer nerds back in the 70s, one domain. Not many had the other domain of having taken calligraphy at Reed College. But in Steve Jobs' mind, that meant fonts, which for many years Apple was the only one doing. I think one of the greatest examples of all the diversity in one brain, and Gary has bits of this because he's a polymath, is Charles Darwin, who became very conversant in about 8 important different areas, but he wasn't an expert in any of them, right? Like dog breeding, pigeons, mollusks, the age of stones and the Earth's crust. I mean, he had a lot of different areas where he was sort of a gentleman scholar, passionate generalist, and he kind of figured out, had that big insight.
So how do you get back or in touch with Gary? Like, where did you reconnect?
Well,
the beauty of social media, I suppose. So
I think somehow, and I think your wife read my book, one of my books years ago, but somehow we must have already been connected on Facebook. And then we just started talking. We didn't meet in person until last February when my now wife and I flew up to Vancouver.
What's the name of your book?
This is Ordinary Magic. The promises I kept to my mother through life, illness, and a very long walk. So it's sort of a love story at the end of life. Nothing to do with the law.
All right. Very cool. All right. Let's get to important topic. Sparking invention, the creative process. Let's go to Gary here. How do things start, and then what's the steps? How do you get off the starting block? Because I know a lot of people probably just sit there and sit there and sit there and sit there, and nothing happens. And obviously, you make things happen.
Well, because they're sitting there trying to invent something, and that's not really the best approach. So the approach for me is, and I finally realized this after a while, that the hardest part, the most creative part of a lot of inventions is identifying the problem and realizing it can be solved. And then once you identify the problem, the solution, and I'll never say becomes obvious because, in patent world, you can't say that, but
obviously,
but the solution,
some patent humor here.
But the solution follows fairly closely once you come up with the problem. And the other thing is to recognize that sometimes the solution precedes the problem, which is strange. But if you pay attention to things that catch your eye, that you think have significance for some reason or another, you'll have them at your fingertips when the problem they solve comes across your desk. Advertising companies have figured this out a long time ago. I mean, they run ads for with the Muppets for I think the Toyota Highlander had the Muppets in an ad that was running on Saturday morning cartoons. Well, they weren't really trying to sell to 5-year-olds. What they were doing is they're planting this idea that at some point these kids are going to need a car. At some point, the parents are going to look at a car, and at that point, they'll go, oh, I already know the solution. I already solved this problem. I know we need the Highlander. And that is, I think, the best pathway to innovation is when you're really internally motivated to solve a problem and you're paying attention to solutions as they come.
Have you ever had a situation where you came up with a solution and the problem hadn't even happened yet? And as you're designing this, or right after you patent it or something, then someone introduced some other technology that created the problem?
Well, I've not had that in exactly that sequence, but I've had something very close, which is when I invent, I'll rather than looking at sort of just a two-dimensional small area, like this is what we do, this is what we know how to do, we're just going to file on that. I'll think, oh, okay, well, this is good. I invented this this flight safety thing for single engine airplanes, but maybe big airlines would be interested in it. So I would think of what parts would work for them, and then, well, does this have any utility in other modes of transportation? And so when you're filing the patent, you're not just filing the patent in your area; you're filing it in all of the areas you think that you can eventually license to, and then sure enough, the problem does come up in another field. And it's like, well, I already came up with a solution for that when I was solving a related problem in my field. So yeah, it does happen. And it's just and I should also emphasize, because people miss this entirely, it's the subconscious that does the hard work. There's a physicist, I believe, out of UC Santa Barbara that actually figured out, using thermodynamics, I still don't understand his methodology, I'm not even close to understanding it, but that the human, the bit rate for the conscious mind in humans is something like early modems, like 300 bits per second. We are not capable of doing very much in our conscious mind. If I threw between 10 and 12 pennies on the ground, you couldn't just instantly count them. You'd have to but your subconscious will notice things. So if I showed you an image of an enormous landscape, and in the corner of the landscape is a predator, your subconscious will immediately go, oh, problem in the corner. And you're not analyzing every pixel. It's just, that's how your subconscious works. And the analogy here, which didn't exist until recently, is GPUs, and how they have not very powerful cores, but they have so many cores that they're constantly solving things in parallel. Your subconscious does that. Your conscious brain, you're thinking linearly, and that's just how it works. So a lot of the time, my best approach is to say, I can't solve this now, but I am committed to solving it. And then just check in with myself every day or two and think, how am I doing on this? And sometimes I'll observe something and I make the connection, and there's the patent application. Well, connection plus the money for the lawyers, then there's the application.
Other than thinking about it and stuff, do you think there's any way to train your subconscious, or is that something that is subconscious?
So the answer is, it's possible to untrain your brain and regain your creativity. So if you give a 5-year-old a hot dog, the chances are they're going to not necessarily know to eat it from the ends. They'll eat it from the top, they'll pull it apart, they'll do whatever, because they don't know that you're supposed to eat a hot dog a certain way. So they're automatically creative. They're constantly creating new games on the playground. They have so many examples from when my kids were growing up, but I took one of my kids up to Yosemite during a snowstorm, and we were doing photography, and she said, oh, I'm gonna use the flash, and snow is coming down, and the only objects anywhere near us were maybe 300-400 meters away. And I'm like, well, you can do it, but it's not going to work. It's not going to work at all. And she did it, and the flash illuminated the snowflakes in a way that I didn't see coming, but she apparently thought would be cool. That was her goal, was to photograph the snowflakes. And it's one of the most beautiful pictures that I've seen. So, the trick is, don't shut down your childhood creativity. I almost shut hers down. And this is what I do for a living, is creativity. So the trick is, don't shut your kid down. Don't shut yourself down too. So remember, you could invent it when you were 5, and you've been taught, you got the right answers the wrong way, so you're getting an F, that kind of thing in school. And so in the early days of school, it's about exploring your creativity. And then by around 3rd grade, it becomes much more about, here are the things that are dangerous. Here are the things we know don't work. Here are all the limits. And, if you just take those limits and you make them conditional. So, I trust that these limits exist, but I'm willing to test them. And, then I always have to add, because kids listen, you have to test them safely. Because, I have had a child I worked with take apart a hairdryer when I didn't used to give those warnings while it was plugged in. So yeah, definitely work with your parents if you're a kid to make sure it's safe. But yeah, we just have assumptions which are turned into what we think of as rules. So we don't have to rethink everything. So, the assumption is, for example, the rules on
I'm
crossing
sorry,
street.
because let's
Going on?
continue that,
Okay.
but
I'm
let's
out.
take a break. Everyone, audience, thank you for tuning into part 1 of Unraveling Intellectual Property with Michael Stein. I'm very excited. We will have Gary Shuster and Cameron Powell back for part 2. And thank you for watching. Till next time.